Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and I'm so pleased you've joined me for today's show. Today, we're exploring the location-specific tenancy guidelines for the great state of Vermont. In all of my location-specific episodes, I've included hyperlinks and all kinds of resources to the state or province or wherever we're talking about. In this case, Vermont residential rental agreements. And so there's all kinds of information, self-help. Let's see, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It looks like I've got 8 hyperlinks in the description of this podcast. So if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or mylifeasalandlord.com, whatever it is, and the write-up, you're going to see tons of hyperlinks. Or if you are watching this on YouTube at My Life as a Landlord, then I'm actually going to screen share, and we're going to go through some of these hyperlinks right now. So with any residential tenancy law, it is an actual law. So on the screen right now is the Vermont statutes online from the Vermont General Assembly, and you will see Title IX, Commerce and Trade, Chapter 137, Residential Rental Agreements, and it is very legalese, which is normal because guess what? Yeah, it's a law. And you can read through this entire thing. It's actually not that long, and I've seen it way more complicated than this in other locations. And so pretty standard items, but what we're going to do is go through the same framework that I have for all of my location-specific podcasts. And here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the basics of Vermont residential rental agreements and supporting documents. We're going to talk about the nuances and what stands out that I've seen compared to other locations. Some guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant in Vermont. And then finally, where to get help in your local area in Vermont if you are a landlord or a tenant. Now, I have to tell you my disclaimer that there may be more guiding documents, more resources than what I'm giving you here. This is not everything. This will just get you started and give you some guidance. There may be other things in your local state, province, county, city, parish, whatever it might be, things like you might have to register your rental or you might need to be licensed. I don't think that's the case in Vermont, but you won't know unless you dig more on your specific rental. So this episode is not all inclusive. You must research further in your specific area, but today's episode will at least get you started. I also need to put in a plug today for our sponsor, Aloha Capital Investments, LLC. If you want to know more about real estate investing, check out alohajv.com. That's alohajulietVictor.com. All right, let's get into it. We've got the share screen on the screen here. I've got share, I've got it up. And so just looking through, I'm just scrolling down some of this. Now, this is very legalese, so I'm actually going to shift off of this. If you want to read more, the hyperlink for the Vermont residential rental agreement is in the description of the show, but there's always a guideline or workbook or something, information sheet, fact sheet. And so this is called Finding Common Ground, the Definitive Guide to Renting in Vermont, produced by Vermont Landlord Association. And let's see, I can't read how small that is, but this hyperlink is in here as well. So this is a PDF. We're going to go through the PDF. Now, the PDF is 100 pages long. I promise you, I am not going to go through all 100 pages, but I will hit the high points. This is actually very, very easy to read, and it's full of information. So you want to make sure that if you're a landlord or a tenant that you're watching this, that you're reading this, know the game, the rules of the game that you are playing. And of course, in their table of contents, this is on page 3, they've got tons of hyperlinks that just jump to the great sections, which there's lots of other guides that I've seen that don't have the hyperlinks. So this is good. And so let's go. Before you rent to me, do the laws apply to me? Now, this is tenant focused, right? It can be some landlord focused. Sorry about that. So this explains who is who's a landlord, who's a tenant, rental agreement, exclusions, tips for renters, tips for owners. This is talking about doing a walkthrough on page 6, security deposits. Now, security deposits Yeah, it depends on where you are in Vermont. In different locations, Vermont requires deposits to be held in a trust-bearing account, but not all of them. And interest earned would go to the renter, but you must check this before you start renting, because two cities, Burlington and Barre, limit how much the security deposit can be. Everyone else, it seems to be open to interpretation. I can't find anything else about it. Burlington, oh, wait a minute. It says Burlington, Burlington and Brattleboro ordinances also allow for owner to connect no more than 1/2 month's rent as pet deposit. So there's a couple different ones about security deposit. First month's, it's a common belief that an owner can't ask for first month's, last month's security deposit. In reality, it's never been accurate. Only in Burlington and Brattleboro limit a security deposit to no more than 1 month's rent. Elsewhere in the state, there is no limit on deposits. So if you've got a couple of different things that apply to you, such as pets, such as security deposits, it defines in here, there's no such thing as a non-refundable deposit. And make sure you know that renters cannot use a deposit as last month's rent. Just a reminder that rent is a payment for a service, but a deposit is actually money that the landlord holds for the tenant. And so it's not, even though they're both money, they're not the same thing. So we want to make sure that we are, you're being very smart about what you can do with your deposits and how much you can charge. So depending on your location of your rental, if it's either in Burlington or Brattleboro, make sure you are looking at the amounts of the deposits and what you can have for that. Insurance for both parties, tips for renters, tips for owners. Basically, you're making sure that a renter knows that if you've got personal property, that if there's a loss at the property, the owner will use their insurance to get the property back. The renter cannot get their personal property back unless they have renter's insurance to cover that as well. Rental agreements, what should be written in a lease, when problems occur. And for renters, there's a couple of different options for Vermont tenants to get lease reviewed, and then by Vermont tenants, but also same thing for landlord, Vermont Landlord Association, which I will put the hyperlink for the Vermont Landlord Association as a resource. Make sure you've got that. And using a generic lease from the internet or a store is not always in your best interest. The lease clauses must match the laws of the state that your rental is in. This is right in the Vermont guiding document here. So you've got late fees and penalties. This is always a good one. This is on page 7 of the guide we're going through here on the screen. If you're at YouTube, at mylifeasalandlord.com. For a late fee, you can charge for a landlord. A landlord can charge a late fee if the renter does not pay rent on time, and it's reasonably related to the cost of collection. This means that the fee needs to have some relation to the costs imposed on you if the renter does not pay their rent on time, or related to the time you spend following up with the renter. Late fee, that is a flat fee, is in the range of $20 to $25 is usually acceptable. Our late fee is $25. Per day late fee is not allowed in Vermont, which is interesting. We have seen this in other locations where a per day late fee is permitted, but in Vermont it's not. Also, there is a consider an early payment discount instead of a late fee. I've seen this as a bone of contention in other locations where you're saying, you know, if you pay on or before the first of each month, you get a deduction in your rent. So how Vermont looks at it, they're saying an early payment discount is a reward to the renter for paying their rent before it's actually due, as a penalty, as opposed to a penalty for paying late. Very interesting. I've seen other states and provinces interpret it a little different, but in Vermont, that's how they do it. Let's see, leases for making the renter responsible for the repairs, leases restricting guests. There's a bunch of different ones in here. Lease termination clauses. There's a bunch of guidance, and it's interesting because they've set it up in 2 columns here. So you've got tips for renters on the left, tips for owners on the right. this is really good because it's not just skewed. Most of the time, the guides that I see are skewed just for tenants. They're just for, hey, make sure you are doing this as a tenant. This is actually for both audiences, which is really unique. I think it's very well done. Section 3, this is on page 9 of the guide. This is called legal protection, and it brings up exactly renters, owners and renters' rights and responsibilities covered by, guess what? Title 9, Vermont Statutes Annotated, Chapter 137, which is exactly what was the first document that I showed you. So that's the hyperlink there. That's pretty good. We talk about fair housing in this guide as well. There's some protected classes, tips for owners on making sure that you are not discriminating. And is the property covered? Vermont law, let's see, Vermont law provides very limited exceptions to other fair housing laws, even if the property is exempt from fair housing. Advertising requirements and discrimination based on race, color, national origin are always covered. So you want to make sure that as you're advertising, that you're advertising for the unit and not for the person or the people that you're looking for. That's important. Buildings with 3 or fewer apartments are not covered, but only if the owner or a member of the owner's immediate family lives in one of the apartments. And so they've put a nuance in here in Vermont. In the city of Burlington, the exemption only applies to buildings with 2 apartments, a duplex. And so then somebody's got to live, either the owner or the owner's immediate family have to live in one of the other apartments. Refusing to rent to a potential tenant under the age of 18 is acceptable. So this is, again, we're going through the limited exceptions in the state of Vermont. Religious preferences given to tenants of the same religion as that of religious association, which provides or rents rooms for not-for-profit, is acceptable. And then rent units for elderly, which discriminate against families with children, are acceptable if the housing is only occupied by people older than 62, or if at least one person over the age of 55 resides in each unit and the complex provides significant facilities or services or important housing opportunities for the elderly. So it's elderly oriented, right? So we've seen that in British Columbia as well, that you can't discriminate about children, but you also need to make sure that if you have an elderly oriented building, that is stated as well. And then the last one for the very limited exemptions for fair housing laws, renting units in which would be too small for a family deserving to live there based on the applicable occupancy standards is illegal. So I'm going to read that one again because I read it fast. Renting units which would be too small for the family desiring to live there based on the applicable occupancy standards is illegal. So if it's too small, so if it's a 1-bedroom for like a four-person, that's illegal. So you have to be able to rent to them. So this can get confusing. So make sure you're asking questions for your all your resources there in Vermont, and it can get really confusing really quickly. Familial status discrimination, it continues on. So let's talk about reasonable occupancy standard. This is something really interesting that not all states or provinces address, but Vermont does. So as a general rule, occupancy standards limit tenants to 2 people per bedroom or approved sleeping area, which is a room within a unit that are used for sleeping must comply with fire safety requirements. So you can't sleep on like a back porch or anything, or following municipal occupancy limits or permit for the property that limits occupancy do not violate fair housing laws. So basically 2 people per bedroom. 2 people per bedroom. And so what we normally do is we do 2 people per bedroom and then plus 1. And so if it's a 2-bedroom, we'll go up to 5. Or if it's a 1-bedroom, we'll go up to 3. But we also include every heartbeat. So we've got all adults, all children, and pets. So we do our being calculations a little bit differently, but we do abide by this calculation for occupancy standards. This is interesting. Rules that limit the number of children per unit instead of number of people per unit are discriminatory. You got to make sure you're accounting for every person and not just number of children. And then in reviewing occupancy cases, HUD, which is Housing and Urban Development, that's a federal standard, and the Vermont Human Rights Commission consider the size and number of bedrooms and other special circumstances. So tips for owners. I'm going to read this just because this occupancy issue has always been something that is coming up a lot on social media. So I'm going to read this one. This is on page 12. Tips for owners. It is the parents' decision if they want children, including the opposite sex children, to share a bedroom. Rules related to noise must bar everyone from making unnecessarily loud noises, not just children. It's true, it's quiet enjoyment for everyone, not just children. Create rules that apply to everyone. Offer services or privileges that apply to everyone, including children. Advertise or describe the unit as is rather than who would be a good applicant, and avoid phrases such as ideal for singles or great place for couples, as these can be interpreted as attempting to exclude children. Interesting wording, right? Moving on, defining disability. I'm going to keep going. Live-in aids for people with disabilities, reasonable accommodations. These are all very standard, and as a landlord, this should be part of your standard understanding of leasing a housing unit. If someone requests a reasonable accommodation under fair housing law, this comes back. And there are also sample form letters on how to do accommodating reasonable accommodations for occupants with disabilities. And so we'll get into that a little bit later as we get through this. But what is a reasonable accommodation? It's all explained in here for this. Again, it continues on tips for owners, tips for renters. Very well done, Vermont. Really happy with how this is laid out. And then there's a snippet in here about advertising and fair housing law and what the law states. Again, tips for renters who think they are experiencing discrimination. And possible tenant screening criteria. This is interesting. This is on page 16. So if you are interested, if you have a rental in Vermont, take a look at that. It says permissible tenant screening criteria demonstrates ability to pay rent on time, landlord and or personal references, credit checks, and including minimum credit score requirements, criminal history. An applicant may request an opportunity to explain any negative circumstances, and a request for a reasonable accommodation by an applicant cannot be a basis to refuse rent. You can't refuse to rent to them. Very interesting. And nowhere in there did you see or did you hear that it's the number of units, the age of the person, the sex of the person, the religion. You didn't hear that at all, right? It's just, ability to pay, references, and criteria to qualify them. Very interesting. Okay, illegal retaliation. This comes up quite a bit. And in landlord retaliation, I always look at what's the time. There's always a time limit, or there sometimes is a time limit. Most of the time there is a time limit that says by the time from when a tenant does some kind of act, whether it's a complaint or what appears to be an unreasonable amount of unreasonable, correction requests, maintenance requests, whatever it is, there is a time that a landlord cannot do something that might be appearing retaliatory, like rent increase, decrease in services, trying to evict, things like that. And so in this case, I'm just looking for the time. So here it is. If a landlord serves notice of termination of tenancy on any grounds other than non-payment of rent within 90 days, 90 days. So that's where it appears. Now, it's not all, there's a time in all of them I've seen. If you've listened to the last episode in Nebraska, there is no time limit. It's just for the length of the tenancy, the landlord cannot retaliate, period. But within 90 days here in Vermont, this is interesting how this works. Privacy and rights, we're talking about when is reasonable, proper notice to enter. You must have a renter's consent. And then let's talk about rent increases. This is on page 19. An increase in rent shall take effect on the first of the day of the rental period following no less than 60 days notice to the renter. So you've got to give notice 60 days in advance. Let me make sure I'm catching all of this. And of course, that is in most locations if it's a fixed lease, right? Now, that's not true in every place. If you have a rental in Burlington city ordinances require a 90-day notice period for any rent increase. However, in Vermont, there is no limit on how much of an increase can be unless the limit is set out in the lease. So unless your lease limits how much you can increase the rent, which is not normally something that you put in there, but it can be put in there. That's not something I would normally include. Okay, so there is a form letter as well. You'll see this in the tools section at the back of the guidebook we're going to go through. And of course, this is so great. I'm really impressed, Vermont. You guys did a good job. In this PDF, there is a hyperlink that jumps right to that form letter about rent increases, which is cool. That's super helpful. You know, help people win, right? That's good. So housing codes, section 4, this is on page 20. We're talking about owners, general responsibilities of renters, and then codes that apply. This is actually very helpful because other states and provinces do not do this. So it says codes that apply. Rental housing health code, Vermont fire safety code, wastewater water supply regulations, and then local ordinances. There it is. You have a checklist of exactly what you need. We're going to go through some of those things because they all apply in here. And it's super well done. Very easy to read. It's long, but it's not hard. It's just long. Okay, requirements for compliance. This is talking about the services of exactly what a landlord is renting to a tenant, of exactly what it is, including garbage, bathroom facilities, ventilation. I mean, some of this is a little bit inherent, but maybe it's not. Here's another example on page 22, insects and rodents. Who's responsible? Talking about bed bugs, avoiding getting bed bugs, avoiding spreading bed bugs, structural elements, utilities, fire safety, lead poisoning. So the lead paint disclosure is always in there. That's a federal requirement. And let's see, I'm just scrolling down here just to see. So the benefits of the lead paint law. So it protects children, protects property owners, protects workers. You're going to see this a lot. And I talk about this in these location specific podcasts. I talk about lead paint a lot. Keeping the property in good shape. This is both for owners and for renters. And then we get into the inevitable disputes. When problems occur, legal tenant remedies. So using repair and deduct for minor repairs. You want to do documentation. A tenant that's trying to repair and deduct has to have provided a form letter to their landlord. Of course, there's a hyperlink to the form letter that the tenant has to use. Health and safety repairs, withholding of rent. All of this has to be done in writing, of course. And top of page 29, if the owner is responsible for paying water bills and the bill is not getting paid, it says straight on the top, begin by contacting your code inspector or town health officer. And it just goes on from there. I'm not going to go into it too much. Common problems, issues between neighbors. This is on page 30, and it has tips for owners, tips for renters. So you want to make sure you are you're all creating an environment of safety and of quiet enjoyment. And, or in this case, Vermont calls it peaceable enjoyment. So they're talking about a few examples of violations of a renter's right to peaceable enjoyment, including excessive noise at times designated by your town as noise curfew hours. This is also known as a noise bylaw. Harassment while in common areas, violence or threats towards you or your guests, or damage to your property. Very good that they go into this. Oh, here's another good one. Lawn care and snow removal. So this is very important that in your written lease agreement that who is doing what. And it says the first point in here, owners are not required to provide lawn care or snow removal unless it is included in the terms of the rental agreement. But it also explains if snow removal is included or if lawn care is not included, that what do you actually do? So, but you want to make sure that the property remains safe and kept, right? Parking questions. It's another one. Owners are not required to provide parking unless it's included in the terms of the rental agreement. TV, satellite dishes, and antennas. And yeah, so they've got actually, it says, while these services are not addressed in Vermont landlord tenant laws, they are covered by FCC regulations, FCC federal, I forget what FCC stands for, but there's a fact sheet here on there, and that has to do with placement of antennas and dishes. Yep. Utility diversion is the term that's described when a situation where a renter is paying for utility use outside of their unit. This includes common areas or other units used exclusively by the owner, such as buildings. If a renter thinks they may be paying for utilities they are not using, they should start by talking to the owner. Amazing. So options available to renters and then tips for owners. You want to make sure that you are monitoring things properly and that it's all written down, right? Appliances. Owners are not required to provide appliances such as a stove and a refrigerator, but if they are provided, the owner is obligated to keep them in good working order. So there's a couple different nuances about appliances. We're just going to keep going here. Section 6, moving out. This is on page 33. Legal reasons for breaking a lease. And there's some different options, one of which is a renter is called to active duty by the armed forces. There's all kinds of information about using military orders to break a lease, and you're not actually breaking the lease, you're just departing early, and it's out of your control. Okay, tips for owners, notice requirement for moving renters. So the law is not a 30-day notice. It is no less than one full renter period written notice. So yeah, so this is a sticking point. This happens a lot. So it's not 30 days in Vermont. It's one full rental period. So if your tenant gives you notice on the 2nd of the month that they're going to be out by the 30th of that month or 31st, right? That's actually not proper notice. It's one full rental period. They would be out by the 30th or the 31st of the next month, if that makes sense. So the example they give, if you give notice on or before June 30th, that your notice period is the month of July, you would vacate by midnight on July 31st. Okay, but there is a nuance here. Burlington city ordinances require a tenant moving out to give 2 full rental periods notice unless otherwise stated in the lease. I've never seen that before. That's the first time I've ever seen a tenant require additional days for giving notice to depart. Expectations of move-out conditions are on page 34. Security, deposit refunds, and disputes. Just in most instances, deposit disputes are settled in small claims. In Burlington, the House Review Board can be used instead of small claims court. You want to make sure, or Housing Review Board, you want to make sure you know what applies to you. So if you have a rental in Burlington, there are lots of different nuances. Make sure that you are understanding the specific requirements for your rental in Burlington. If you're not in Burlington, then the majority of this is going to apply, but you still need to make sure that you are catching all of this stuff for wherever your rental is in Vermont. Unclaimed property after move out. Let's talk about this. This only applies to property left behind in a rental unit after the renter has given notice to the owner that the renters have moved out, or after the renter has moved out at the end of a lease term. So it does end abruptly. Let me make sure that I've got so the lease term does end abruptly, meaning at the end of a fixed lease term, let's say it's 1 year, it does not automatically terminate. It does not automatically change to a periodic tenancy. So for example, in other locations, it will automatically change to a month-to-month lease unless it is renewed. In Vermont, it's a fixed lease. And so it does end abruptly, meaning if you do not express to your landlord as a tenant, if you do not express to your landlord that you want to renew, you want to stay in the unit, or you're going to sign a new lease, then they are deeming that you are leaving on 1 year and 1 day, that you'll be gone. So it's important that you guys communicate because it does end abruptly here. But let's go back to personal property. Any personal property remaining in the dwelling unit or leased premises after the tenant has vacated may be disposed of by the landlord without notice or liability to the tenant or owner of the personal property. And so you've got, and then there's two issues here. It says for property left behind after an eviction, see page 46, which we'll get to. And then for property left behind when a unit is abandoned, see page 47. So one is that eviction where the tenant has been removed. One is when the unit has been abandoned, meaning the tenant has either passed away, or maybe they're become incapacitated. Maybe they've become incarcerated. That's the other issue, is that people get to the point where they can't return to the unit. And so it's deemed abandoned and what to do. Okay, page 36 talks about references. And this is actually really interesting how this works. It says there are no landlord-tenant laws covering what a landlord can or cannot say when being asked to give a reference on a tenant. References may fall within libel, meaning written or slander, verbal statements, if the information provided is not true. These 2 laws would apply about comments made by renters about owners. So renters, if you think a landlord may give you a bad reference, there is a whole page here about what to do on how to either remedy that or what to do to get you a good reference. It also has more tips for owners, tips for renters. And let's keep moving on. So page 37, termination of tenancy by the owner, termination for non-payment of rent. It goes all in here on how to do this, how to demand rent, and then how to move forward with eviction. Termination notice for cause, meaning there's some mischief going on. Termination of tenancy for no cause, meaning the tenant hasn't done anything wrong, but the owner either wants to move in, immediate family member wants to move in, or they want to do substantial renovations, or they want to take the unit out of the rental pool. There's a couple different other things, but basically the tenant hasn't done anything wrong, but the owner wants the unit back for whatever reason. And so notice periods for no clause, there is a huge laundry list of where you are and however long the renter has lived in the unit of what the amount of notice is. And so make sure this is on page 39. This is, it gets really tricky on, so like, for example, if the renter has lived in the unit in Burlington less than 2 years, you have to give them no less than 90-day notice that the owner wants the unit back. And this is, of course, assuming that the rent is paid monthly. So, yeah, this is interesting how this all works. But, oh, and here's the other one is if the owner wants the renter to move out at the end of the lease period, the owner must give notice of at least 30 days before the end of the lease if the renter has resided in the property for less than 2 years, and 60 days if the renter has resided in the property for more than 2 years. So it does it does end abruptly, but you still have to have some period of notice that you intend to not renew. This is really, it can get really detailed here. Okay. Termination of tenancy for sale of building. Owners may terminate the tenancy in order to sell the building only if there is a signed sale and purchase agreement with potential buyers and the renters are not currently in a lease. If they are currently in a lease, then you cannot terminate the tenancy because you have a fixed lease. The lease would just transfer with the sale. This talks about foreclosure, eviction of farm workers. This was unique to Vermont, which I wasn't expecting, but this was talking about farm workers who receive housing as a benefit of their employment. They can't just be thrown out of their homes if they lose their jobs. There's a whole section on this. And end of notice period. If the renters are still residing in the unit, yeah, okay, so you might have to evict them, but it's illegal for a landlord to remove a renter's property, change the locks, or turn off essential services. This is called unlawful trespass. If they change the locks, that's really bad. Don't do that. Legal tenant remedies for attempted illegal eviction. There's all kinds of things that will get you in trouble. Landlords don't do this. And then it talks about the court eviction process. So section 8, starting 42, page 42 and following. But there is one thing that is in here about mediation. If you wanted to try to do mediation with your tenant, you can do a mediation application at vtlandlord.com, but you can just go right to court. But if you do mediation, it looks like mediation costs up to $3,000 are covered for free to help both the tenant and the landlord to work the dispute out, especially if you're just having a misunderstanding of something that you can actually resolve it, then that would help. Otherwise, you're going to go to court. Now, there's all kinds of eviction terminology of at the top of page 43, the court process. Now, I've said this in the past. If you know that you are headed towards an eviction, or maybe you've got a hearing date, and you're a landlord and sometimes you can be quite anxious about this. My recommendation is to go to court in advance ahead of your hearing and watch. Learn the whole process. Learn on where to park. Do you have to pay parking meters, or where do you actually get in the door? You learn the whole system before your hearing date. It will reduce your anxiety a bit. And so when your hearing date comes, you already are going to understand how to actually show up. What does it look like? What does the bailiff say? How does the judge react? Where do you stand? And so if you're trying to figure out all of this on the day of your hearing, it can get really, it can get even more anxiety inducing. So make sure that you are looking at everything in advance, I highly recommend that you do this. So there's also something in Vermont called a rent escrow hearing. And this is where you are, the tenant is ordered to pay rent escrow, which basically they put money into an escrow account with the court. So there's a couple of different ways they use this. I'm going to leave that here. This is all on page 44. So make sure you're looking at that. The complaint, the answer, the final hearing. And then, of course, you've got a writ of possession. So if you've had a eviction of any kind awarded to you, the writ of possession is a judgment ordered by the court that allows the sheriff to then remove the occupants and the owner to change the locks. And then the sheriff serves the writ of possession to the defendant, to the tenant, and then give them a lockout date. Basically, you give them a date and say, look, if you're not out, we are changing the locks on this day. And then this is where the abandoned items or eviction items come into this. This is on page 47, abandonment of a rental unit. So this is where you can have unclaimed property after the abandonment of a unit. It goes all into here, but basically the owner's got to store the tenant's property in a safe, dry space for no less than 60 days. You've got to try to get a hold of the tenant. Even if you've evicted them, you still have to get a hold of them and say, look, here's where your stuff is. You have 60 days to get it. You're responsible for all of the charges, including the storage. And then if the renter doesn't claim their property within the required time, the property shall become the property of the owner. And then what they can do is the owner can either sell it or dispose of it, whatever. But it's very specific on the unclaimed property after the abandonment of a unit. And then, of course, on page 48 and following is all of these form letters for renters, form letters for owners, and then additional tools, which is actually really helpful. This is really great that there's they are pre-made forms that you can print, but you can't fill them in on a PDF and then just print and sign them. But you could fake it. I mean, you could print it and use it just as well. And there, of course, are a bunch of hyperlinks, which is super easy when you're just trying to go to the next one. You don't have to scroll down. So insufficient notice of rent increase in Burlington. This is very important that you've got this saying you've done this wrong. This is a tenant giving a notice to a landlord or a property manager. And then, of course, insufficient notice of rent increase statewide. And so you can see there's two different types of form letters based on your geographic location in Vermont. So make sure you're using the right one. Late fees. This is a late fee notice. Major code violation repair request form letter. Wow. This is a good one. Move out notice from renter to owner. This is good. Repair and deduct form letter. And talking about reasonable accommodation request for modification, security deposit return request form letter, lead paint disclosure. This is important. This is actually really good that it's simply put right there. I've seen it in a couple different ways with the same wording, which is great. Notice to occupants. This is, oh, it looks like this is a poster. Notice to occupants about preventing lead poisoning. Interesting. Okay. That's interesting. Okay. Termination for non-payment of rent. Sample notice, do not make changes to the language. So this tells you that whatever words are on here, this is actually what you want to put on your actual letter. Now, this is not printable because it says here is, well, I guess you can print it and then you would just write next to it. I guess you can print it. Notice received by. Now, note, you will see this. It says termination for non-payment of rent. At the very bottom, it says notice received by tenant name. And they're supposed to sign it, meaning you've served them. What if you can't serve them? That's difficult. So you've got to make reasonable requests that you're trying to serve them. On page 64 and following, you have a condition inspection checklists. Not bad, not bad. So you've got move in on one column, move out on one column, landlord tenant signature. That's good. Then you've got sample household budget worksheets. Oh, this is helpful so that people can help with their actual expenses, income savings. This is actually interesting. It's sort of like a cash flow card for those of you who've played the game cash flow. Interesting. Oh, this is the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. There you go. Federal Communications Commission. Information about satellite antennas. So this is just an information. Insurance on rental properties. And renters insurance, talking more about renters insurance. So we've gone past the pre-made forms, and so now it's just additional information. And then here we go, Appendix B, this is on page 72, is resources. So you've got statewide housing advocacy programs, Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, statewide communication offices, legal assistant. There's hyperlinks in every single one of these that I'm talking about, which is really helpful. So even despite what I even have in the description of this podcast, make sure that you are looking at these as well. And in fact, I've got a couple of these. Oh, here's another one, legal assistant, vtbar.org / find a lawyer. So Vermont Landlord Association, we'll talk more about that. Vermont Legal Aid, vtlegalaid.org or vtlawhelp.org. Legal clinics open to anyone. There are 5 different lists in here. If you're looking for a legal clinic in Vermont, so there's legal clinics, low income, and then legal clinics open to anyone. Then there's HUD, Housing Enforcement Town Health Officers, Human Rights Commission, and then the statutes. And so it goes on. Actually, it has, oh, this is interesting. It actually has at the very end, Title IX, Chapter 137, Residential Rental Agreement. At the very end, that's the I'll be darned, that's the end of this. It goes into all this. And then the Rental Housing Health Code. Very interesting that it's all there. Okay, that's one of the reasons why it was so long, is because it has all that in there. Okay, so that is that guide. Wow, that was a longer review than I thought, but let's move on to the next one. There's a couple different ones I wanted to go through, and then we will check on how I'm doing with providing the 4 items that I told you I would. So this is a resources for renters and landlords. This is one of the hyperlinks that I provided in the description. An official Vermont government website. This is the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and it is specifically resources for renters and landlords. And so you've got for landlords, membership organizations, repair and renovation loans for landlords, resources for landlords, specifically in Burlington, Vermont Department of Public Safety, Division of Fire Safety, lead-based paint, landlord certificate, and renter credit. These are really interesting how this works. And I wanted to go into this. So this landlord certificate and renter credit, contact the Vermont Department of Taxes. So landlord certificates, I am going to open this in the new tab because I want, it's for your taxes. And so it looks like you've got, if you're doing a rental, probably a long-term rental, that you will get a credit for, yeah, landlord certificates play a vital role in the renter credit program. It's a refundable tax credit available to eligible Vermont residents who rented during the prior calendar year. Renters may be eligible even if they are not required to file a tax return. So I don't know if this is for your property taxes or this is specifically for helping your tenants, but seems like a good idea. How to complete the certificate. Okay, this is detailed. Okay, so there's tons and tons of resources in all of this. One that I wanted to draw your attention to, Vermont Department of Public Safety, Division of Fire Safety. There is, let me go on to the next one. Oh, this is the Vermont Landlord Association, vtlandlord.com. This is all, so, and this is where you would apply for that mediation that I was telling you about, is at Vermont, vtlandlord.com, apply for mediation. And then as we go down, vermontjudiciary.org has a whole walkthrough of the eviction process and exactly how it would work, written termination notice, starting a court case. It literally walks you through how the whole thing, including security deposits and tenants' belongings. And so you have all of this in here. Sorry, I've got a announcement going on because I'm recording this on a cruise ship. So hang on just a second. Here we go. I'm going to shift to the next one. The next one is firesafety.vermont.gov. This is 2022 Residential Rental Housing Health and Safety Code. This was actually really well done. So well done, Division of Fire Safety. I was very impressed looking at this, and it's just 15 pages long, But the whole idea is it was talking more about health and safety for the tenant in these rental units. And so this is, oh my goodness, here we go. This it's another source document that talks about specifically health and safety of a rental dwelling. So it's talking about definitions. I'm not going to go through the whole thing at all, but it also talks about sanitation facilities, trash control, pest and bed bug control and management, heating, natural ventilation. And then it talks about, it actually has a regional district, a whole map of Vermont and all the different counties. And so it has the 4 different regional offices and their contact information, which is really cool, with phone numbers to all of them. So if there's ever a question, go right ahead and call them. Very well done. Super impressive, actually. That's really helpful. Especially when you're looking at different aspects of who's responsible for what. Okay, that one's that one again. All right, I'm just going to leave that one up as we go through here. I want to make sure I've hit the high points here of, I know I've hit the basics, but let's make sure that we've hit everything for all of your tenancy issues in Vermont. So rental insurance is highly recommended, but it's not required. That's what I found. Pets and animals, there is a pet deposit that you can charge, but pet rent is questionable. Delivery of sign lease is not required, but it's a good idea, obviously. Condition inspection at move-in. They provide a condition inspection, a condition checklist, which is good. Grace period for paying rent. It is none. However, late fee, you can charge the actual cost of late rent. Required maintenance inspections. The answer is yes. We talked about how rent increases worked. Ending a fixed lease and the return of a deposit is 14 days or itemized deductions. You cannot use the deposit as last month's rent. And we talked about the mediation, the costs at vtlandlord.com. You can just go right to court. Now let's talk about a little bit of the nuances in Vermont. We talked about landlord retaliation, farm employee housing. Vermont defines a protected tenant. This is something unique that I didn't see anywhere else, and it makes sense. So as used in this chapter, abuse, protected tenant means a tenant who is a victim of abuse, sexual assault, or stalking, or a parent, a foster parent, legal guardian, or caretaker with at least partial physical custody of a victim of abuse, sexual abuse, or stalking. And sexual assault and stalking have the same meaning, which is interesting. So there's concessions in here that if there is criminal activity, specifically domestic abuse, that a tenant needs to get out of their lease as quickly as possible for safety's sake. That is all in here. And so that's really interesting that Vermont defines a protected tenant, and very specific about changing the locks after criminal or assault activity to protect the protected tenant. This makes sense, but they spell it out anyway, that after this is all done, that a tenant, that a lock on a unit needs to be changed. And landlords must provide a warrant of habitability. We've talked about this, which requires landlord to provide and maintains premises that are safe, clean, and fit for human habitation and compliance with applicable housing codes. And this is where it comes in about the lead paint. This is where the fire safety aspect. Vermont defines normal wear and tear, which is unusual. I don't see this in every single one of the tenancy, like landlord tenancy codes or acts. I don't see this all the time, but I do see it periodically. And so Vermont has this. Normal wear and tear in Vermont is defined as the deterioration which occurs normally with occupancy of a rental unit, which is not the result of negligent, carelessness, accident, or abuse of the premises by tenants or their guests. So, and it's the same. They have it right below a definition of Vermont state law. Normal wear and tear means the deterioration. It looks like the same thing. So a landlord cannot deduct from the security deposit costs of any of the following things except to correct or repair damage caused by a tenant or their guests through negligent, carelessness, or accident or abuse, including routine maintenance, painting, unless carelessness, negligent, accidental, or destructive tenant activity or actions make repainting necessary when it normally would not be, re-advertising the apartment, or renovation of the unit. So the landlord can't they can't deduct the security deposit for advertising costs or renovation of the unit. That makes sense. Abandoned items in Vermont. We talked about unclaimed property and what to do. And then where to get help. There's a lot of different help resources in all of these documents, way more than what I am providing, but they're in the documents. So go into the hyperlinks. As a landlord, if you're listening to My Life as a Landlord, very likely you are a landlord in Vermont. So I would recommend that you would start with the Vermont Landlord Association. That is vtlandlord.com, and just check that out. There's others as well, but that'll at least get you going. Okay, so let's sum up this podcast. Each of my location-specific podcasts are set up in the exact same way, answering the same 4 questions. What are the basics of that state or province landlord housing governing document? What are the nuances? What's different about that place? And then some guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant in a tenancy. And then finally, where to get help in your local location. This is the same format for every location-specific episode. So if you're interested in another geographic area, you already know what I'm going to talk about, just in a different location. This episode, again, is not all-inclusive. You must do your own research further into your specific area, especially if you're in certain cities in Vermont. This is really important that you do your own due diligence here, because in your county, regional district, parish, city, or any other governing body that involves your rental location, it could be different for your specific situation. But today's episode will at least get you started. So if you're listening to this podcast, chances are that you are already or are about to be a landlord in the great state of Vermont. Things that you can do to help yourself are read the Vermont Residential Rental Agreement, which is Vermont Title 9, Chapter 137. Read it. The next thing you can do is get yourself in a group, whether it's either in person or in social media, with like-minded individuals, meaning other landlords in Vermont. Get together and help each other out. You could do that by jumping on social media groups. You could find a local meetup where you can meet in person. Again, you could start with the Vermont Landlords Association. I'm sure they have events that you could go to and support each other, but you want to go and be with other landlords who are asking questions and learning just like you are. Folks, if you learned something today from today's show, could you pretty please give me a review on whatever platform you listen to this podcast on, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or maybe you listen to this at mylifeasalandlord.com. It doesn't matter what platform you listen to this on, but your input really does help. I hope you enjoyed today's show all about Vermont. And today I am recording this episode on board the cruise ship Carnival Splendor, and we are just currently docked into a location in Northern Island of New Zealand. Why? Because real estate takes you places. Where do you want real estate to take you? Join me in the next episode, which is live right now in the library, episode 131, all about the great province of Manitoba.